Thank you very much, Dana, for the fine introduction. And let me just say that this is truly my honor to be part of this depolarization community of practitioners sponsored by IFIT. And it's great to see some very familiar faces whom I've probably seen in Cali, Colombia, and Barcelona, and Oxford as well. And it is truly, my pleasure to be sharing with you some of the insights based on my research. And of course, this goes back to, my own personal history. But just listening to the previous speaker, if you were to ask my wife, we've been married for almost 30 years, she would most likely say that I have this cognitive rigidity and that I don't have fluid imagination. And I probably agree with her. But basically, my sort of personal history with this Sunni Shi'a polarization came, from an early age during my time in Iran as well. My father was the Charge d'Affaires in Tehran at the Indonesian embassy, but he was also the political head there for the political sections of the various embassies in Tehran. So this was my sort of first and initial exposure to the different schools of thought and the different realities, and also realizing that Islam is not a monolithic religion. And of course, this sort of translated also into many of my research and many of my engagements with Shia Muslim scholars in Iran, in Tehran, in the holy city of Qom. And these are just some of the activities that I've been doing. So basically what Indonesia has been seeing, despite its, progress and march toward democratization and liberalization, we still do find anti-Shia propaganda and campaigns. And it is quite worrying at times. And it is also a recurring phenomenon because oftentimes these anti-Shia propaganda and campaign would occur during specific times in a specific year, for instance, during the 10th of Muharram or the Ashura rituals and festivities, for instance. But some of the arguments here is to say that Shia Islam is not part of Islam, and that there's been a religious innovation on the part of the Shia Muslims. But the anti-Shia propaganda also, I must say, sort of culminated during the height of the Syrian war. And of course, Facebook then was not very good at content moderation. In fact, content moderation was not yet there. And what's interesting was that, I became a member of many of the anti-Shia Facebook groups. And later on, interestingly, I was interviewed by Facebook America, Facebook Indonesia, Singapore, Myanmar, the UK, and also the central office in San Francisco to basically, advise Facebook in terms of how they can manage the issue of hate, and basically looking at individuals and groups and symbolisms of hate in Facebook. And this is where the content moderation came about, really, post culmination of the Syrian war. But in terms of the context in Indonesia, as I said, there have been this continuous sort of anti-Shia propaganda and campaigning, which have focused on trying to criminalize Shia Islam. And what we saw right after the height of the Syrian war was this process of excommunication of a small Shia community on the island of Madura in a very remote village in Sampang. And as an effect of this event was that we have now around 300 to 350 IDPs or internally displaced people who are then forced to move in these housing blocks in East Java. And until now, almost 15 years, they have now been living in these quarters, which unfortunately does not really sort of help their livelihood, because much of the people there were initially farmers. At the global level, we are also seeing competing narratives, and we have been seeing Hollywood as this sort of myth-making industry has been persistent in terms of the promulgation of the Persiophobia, I call it, which is this fear against the Persians. And at the height of this current ongoing war between the US, Israel, and Iran, we are continuously being fed day in and day out with such Persophobia. And again, if you look at some of the negative campaignings and propaganda in the Middle East toward Iranians, toward the Persians, you still see the same kinds of criticisms and sort of campaign against the validity of the Shia Islam school of thought. Of course, this is also to some extent a result of the regional competition that we are seeing between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I think we are all quite familiar with the regional geopolitics there in the Middle East. But, considering this idea about cognitive, rigidity, I'm also thinking about how religious leaders and authorities have a certain mindset. And I call this the dictatorship of authenticity, which points always to this sort of extreme view on people who are coming from other schools of thought. And you still see this both in the Sunni world, but also to a certain extent in the Shia world as well. And again, as I mentioned, the context in Indonesia is that we have what's called the Indonesian Council of Ulama, and they produced this small book in 2012, which is essentially to advise the Muslim community to be vigilant against the spread of the Shia Islam ideology. I mean, the book admittedly does not state that Shia is not part of Islam, but essentially they are arguing that the Sunni Muslims in Indonesia should be vigilant and be careful when they are engaging the Shias, both intellectually and as well as socially. So there is the sort of theological criticisms, which have been on and on for more than 1,000 years now. But one of the main issues of criticism is this idea about religious innovation or bid'ah, that many of the rituals and practices of Shia Islam are considered as invalid by the majority Sunni Muslims. And so some of these things include taqiyya, for instance, the practice of taqiyya or prudential dissimulation, mut'ah, which is temporary marriage, and then you have ta'ziyah, which is the visitation to the tombs of saints, which is considered usually by especially the extreme conservative Sunni Muslims as being an act of shirk or partnering Allah, which is obviously against the principles of Tawheed, the oneness of God. But then we also have the Aman message, which came out of Jordan in 2004, which was endorsed by many of the religious scholars, both from the Sunni and Shia world, to essentially give the endorsement to Shia Islam as being part of Islam. And these are just some of the proofs and evidence of the Shia influences in historic Indonesia, where you find a lot of the Shia Islam symbolisms in many of the past kingdoms in Indonesia, both in Aceh, in Sumatra, and also in Cirebon in Java. This is the Ashura procession, which occurs every year in South Sumatra, and I participated the whole 10 days there. And this is called the Tabut, which symbolizes and commemorates the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, which, who is considered as the third Imam in the Shia lineage. So when I'm looking at this Shia-Sunni polarization, the solution spectrum from Mark Friedman comes to mind, looking at the outreach and dialogue, institutional reform, the policy, legal reforms, and also the fact and narrative interventions. And I thought to myself that it would be great to focus on the fact and narrative interventions and how we can sort of depolarize the Sunni and Shia communities through interventions in narratives. And so these are some of the ideas which I have in mind. One is to complicate the narrative. So instead of saying, the Shias are not part of Islam, you say that, the Shias are also part of the historic coming of Islam to Indonesia, for instance. And this is one way to sort of complicate the narrative about the earlier comings of Islam to Indonesia. Second one is perspective taking, or engaging in writing or reading stories from the viewpoint of the disadvantaged groups. And in this case, obviously, the Shia minority is the disadvantaged group in this case. And so I've done some of the writings, and many of the Shia scholars have also came up with books to explain what Shia Islam is from their viewpoint. So this is, to a certain extent, similar like the approach of victimology, where you look at the stories and perspectives from the victims' perspective. And then thirdly is depolarization from below. The principle behind this is that it's always useful to talk to the communities and to gather the stories and the experiences from directly from these communities, instead of listening and hearing stories and maybe half-truth stories coming from people who are not part of the community, but also participating in some of the activities, the interfaith rituals and festivities that would also bring up some of the truth coming out from the communities. The fourth one is constructive controversy. What I mean by this is basically that one should not avoid having disagreements just for the sake of consensus. And so it's always good to sort of avoid weak compromises in the way that we encourage disagreements, and that it's okay to agree, to disagree. And so that's the whole idea about the communication and interaction between the Sunnis and the Shias. This is just one picture that we had with the excommunicated Shia community leader who is now living with his community in East Java. And what's interesting is that because of this persecution and criminalization, he has now reverted to Sunni Islam and saying basically everything that I've read and learned about Shia Islam is wrong. And now I have repented before the religious authorities, obviously Sunni Muslim religious authorities in East Java, and that he has changed course and become a Sunni revert. So basically, that's my research, but this is just a recent event whereby I received a credential from the Majma' Takrib, which is the sort of World Assembly on the proximity of Islamic schools of thought, which occurred in Shah Alam, Malaysia. So basically, this organization attempts to build bridges between the Sunni world and the Shia world, both in Southeast Asia as well as generally in the world. So thank you very much for your kind attention.